Have you ever wondered if the greatest miracle God could place in your hands might look like something everyone else has already thrown away? When a 62-year-old widow rescued a basket of cracked duck eggs from the trash, the entire town laughed and called her foolish. But hidden inside those broken shells was more than fragile new life. It was a forgotten legacy left by her father, a discovery that would transform an entire farming community, and a powerful reminder that God often saves his greatest blessings for the people willing to believe when no one else will. Stay with us, because this unforgettable story proves that hope is never truly broken, as long as someone is willing to protect it. Winter, 2014. Bitter winds swept across the frozen farmland outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, while frost covered quiet fields beneath a heavy gray sky that seemed to hold the entire countryside in silence. Margaret Hale had never been afraid of broken things. At 62 years old, the retired emergency room nurse stood 5'7" with a slender frame that still carried quiet strength despite the passing years. Her shoulder-length silver blonde hair was usually tucked beneath a knitted wool cap, while kind hazel eyes reflected both compassion and exhaustion earned through decades of caring for strangers during the worst moments of their lives. Fine wrinkles framed her gentle smile, and although retirement had softened the urgency in her movements, it had never diminished her instinct to protect life whenever she saw even the smallest chance. Years spent in crowded emergency rooms had taught Margaret that miracles rarely arrived looking perfect. Sometimes they arrived bleeding, sometimes barely breathing. Sometimes everyone else had already given up before she ever touched them. Her husband, Robert Hale, had understood that part of her better than anyone. Robert had been a local carpenter, broad-shouldered with thick gray hair, warm brown eyes, and rough hands shaped by 40 years of building homes across Lancaster County. Patient by nature and slow to anger, he believed every damaged piece of wood deserved one more attempt before being thrown away. Perhaps that was why they had loved each other so deeply. They had both spent their lives repairing what others considered beyond saving. For years earlier, a sudden heart attack had taken Robert while he was repairing an old church roof. Margaret never forgot the helpless feeling of standing beside the hospital bed, where she had spent her own career saving countless strangers, but could do nothing for the man she loved most. After Robert's funeral, the silence inside their home became unbearable. Rather than remain surrounded by memories she could no longer face every day, Margaret sold the small house in town and moved back to the aging farm where her parents had raised her. The farmhouse was modest, with faded white paint, a creaking wooden porch, a vegetable garden, and a weathered chicken coop that held only a handful of aging hens. She did not need much. A quiet life suited her. She spent mornings tending vegetables, afternoons repairing old fences, and evenings reading beside the fireplace with Robert's photograph resting on the mantel. Yet she often wondered whether God still had a purpose for the years she had left. One freezing morning before sunrise, Margaret drove her aging blue pickup toward a large commercial duck farm several miles outside town. She had arranged to collect discarded wooden produce crates that she hoped to repair into nesting boxes for her chickens. The farm already buzzed with activity despite the early hour. Conveyor belts rattled. Workers loaded trucks beneath bright floodlights while forklifts moved pallets through the cold mist. As Margaret walked behind one of the processing buildings searching for empty crates, an unpleasant sound caught her attention. Crash! Another plastic container tipped into a large industrial dumpster. Curious, she stepped closer. Inside lay hundreds of duck eggs. Many carried small cracks across their shells. Some were stained with dirt. Others had simply been rejected by automated sorting machines because of tiny imperfections. Margaret frowned. She reached into the container and gently lifted one of the eggs into her gloved hand. It was warm, not slightly warm from sunlight, warm with life. She picked up another, then another. Nearly all carried hairline cracks, yet many still retained the unmistakable warmth she remembered from years of studying emergency medicine and basic biology. She knew enough about incubation to understand that warmth often meant living embryos still remained inside. A nearby worker noticed her. The young man looked barely 25, wearing a heavy insulated jacket, mud-covered boots, and a wool cap pulled low over sandy blonde hair. His face carried the tired expression of someone working long shifts through winter. "Ma'am," he called politely, "those are rejects. They're no good." They'll never hatch. Margaret looked down at the fragile egg resting carefully between both hands. Who decided that? She asked softly. The machine? The young worker hesitated before shrugging. That's company policy. If they're cracked, we throw them away. Margaret climbed carefully into the dumpster. For nearly an hour, she examined egg after egg, holding each one gently against her cheek to feel its remaining warmth. She ignored those with severe damage, but separated every egg whose crack appeared small enough to possibly survive with proper care. Several employees stopped working just long enough to watch. Some quietly laughed. Others shook their heads. An older forklift driver muttered, "Poor lady, grief makes people do strange things." Margaret heard every word. She simply kept working. By the time the winter sun finally pushed through the clouds, nearly 100 carefully selected eggs rested inside padded wooden baskets lined with old towels. As she loaded them into her pickup truck, she paused for one final glance toward the dumpster overflowing with eggs everyone had already forgotten. Driving slowly home across the frozen countryside, Margaret felt something she had not experienced since Robert's death. Hope, not certainty, not confidence, only a quiet feeling deep inside her heart that perhaps God had placed these fragile lives in her path for a reason she could not yet understand. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel and whispered softly to herself, "If there's even one chance you're still alive, I'm not leaving you behind." The old farmhouse waited quietly beyond the snow-covered fields. And without realizing it, Margaret had just carried home far more than a basket of cracked duck eggs. She had carried home the beginning of a story that would change far more lives than her own. Margaret Hale barely slept that night. The old farmhouse had become strangely alive with quiet purpose. Nearly 100 carefully selected duck eggs rested inside padded wooden baskets near the cast-iron stove, while she checked each one every hour, carefully rotating them by hand to prevent the fragile embryos from settling. The warmth inside the room contrasted sharply with the bitter Pennsylvania winter beyond the frosted windows. Every egg represented a question. Every hour represented hope. The following morning, Margaret walked toward the aging barn behind the farmhouse. It had once belonged to her parents, but after years of neglect its roof sagged slightly, loose boards rattled in the wind, and the old poultry room had become little more than a storage space filled with forgotten tools. She believed the building could become a proper incubation room if she worked carefully enough. Robert would have known exactly how to repair every beam, and for a brief moment she smiled, imagining him teasing her for trying to rebuild half the farm by herself. As she cleared broken shelves from one corner of the barn, her crowbar struck something solid behind an old wooden cabinet that had not been moved in decades. Curious, she pulled the cabinet away, revealing a narrow cedar cupboard built directly into the wall. Dust covered its brass handle, and a faded tag still hung from the lock. Elias Hale, her father's name. Margaret paused. Her father had rarely spoken about his years raising poultry before commercial farming transformed the region. He had always insisted that nature rewarded patience more than speed, but as Margaret grew older and pursued nursing instead of farming, many of his stories slowly disappeared into memory. She carefully opened the cupboard. Inside rested dozens of leather-bound notebooks, bundles of handwritten charts, faded photographs, weather journals, feed formulas, incubation records, and neatly labeled wooden boxes containing small scientific instruments. Every notebook carried the same careful handwriting she remembered from childhood. For hours she forgot about time. One notebook after another described experiments conducted throughout the 1970s on naturally incubating cracked poultry eggs. Her father had recorded temperature changes every hour, humidity variations, shell repair techniques, hatch rates, and detailed observations that resembled medical research more than ordinary farm notes. Margaret slowly whispered, "Dad, what were you working on?" Near the bottom of one page, she noticed repeated references to beeswax. Another described sealing hairline shell fractures using purified natural beeswax before carefully maintaining stable humidity throughout incubation. Her nursing experience immediately recognized the logic. The wax did not repair the shell. It simply protected the delicate membrane beneath while reducing moisture loss long enough for the embryo to continue developing. Yet she also realized something else. She was not qualified to judge whether the method truly worked. That afternoon, she drove nearly an hour to Penn State University's College of Agricultural Sciences, carrying several notebooks inside a weathered canvas bag. There she met Dr. Hannah Cooper. At 35 years old, Hannah was one of the university's youngest veterinary professors specializing in poultry medicine and embryonic development. She stood about 5 feet 6 with a lean athletic build shaped by years working equally comfortably inside laboratories and commercial farms. Her dark chestnut hair was tied neatly into a practical ponytail, while intelligent blue-green eyes constantly reflected quiet curiosity. Light freckles crossed her cheeks, and despite her academic reputation, she preferred denim shirts, work boots, and worn field jackets instead of formal clothing. Hannah had grown up on a struggling family chicken farm that was forced to close during her teenage years after disease swept through the flock. Watching her parents lose everything inspired her to dedicate her career to improving animal welfare rather than maximizing industrial efficiency. Margaret spread the journals across Hannah's office table. The younger woman began reading silently. 1 notebook became 3. 3 became 7. Almost 3 hours passed before Hannah finally leaned back in complete disbelief. "I've never seen documentation like this," she said quietly. She carefully opened 1 notebook filled with hand-drawn diagrams of cracked eggs. "Your father wasn't experimenting randomly. He developed an entire incubation system." Together, they compared Elias Hale's handwritten records with modern veterinary literature. The similarities were astonishing. His observations matched principles that scientists would formally describe decades later. Even more surprising, his beeswax sealing technique appeared scientifically reasonable for carefully selected eggs carrying only minor shell fractures. Hannah looked at Margaret. "If these records are accurate, your father was decades ahead of his time." Margaret lowered her eyes toward the aging journals. "Then why did nobody ever know?" Hannah slowly turned another page. A newspaper clipping had been carefully folded inside. The headline described the rapid expansion of industrial poultry production during the late 1970s. Large commercial hatcheries focused on automation, speed, and efficiency. Repairing individual eggs required too much labor. Discarding them cost less. Convenience had won. Compassion had quietly disappeared. Near sunset, they opened the final notebook. The handwriting had become slower, more fragile. Elias had written only 1 short paragraph. "If there is still a chance for life, never let convenience replace compassion." Neither woman spoke. Margaret gently closed the journal with trembling hands. Suddenly, she no longer felt as though she was trying to save a basket of cracked eggs. She was finishing the work her father had quietly begun more than 40 years earlier. Outside, snow continued falling across the Pennsylvania countryside. Inside the small office, 2 generations of knowledge had finally found each other. And for the first time, Margaret believed those fragile eggs might carry far more than new life. They carried a forgotten legacy waiting for someone willing to believe in it. The first hatch came before sunrise on the 28th day. Margaret Hale had been sitting quietly beside the homemade incubator with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of untouched coffee resting on the table. The farmhouse remained silent except for the soft ticking of the thermometer and the gentle hum of the humidifier she had assembled from old equipment found in her father's barn. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound echoed through the room. 1 tiny crack widened, then another. Margaret leaned closer, hardly daring to breathe. A small yellow beak slowly pushed through the shell, followed by 2 determined black eyes blinking for the first time. Tears filled her hazel eyes. After weeks of uncertainty, careful temperature adjustments, and endless nights of checking every egg by hand, life had answered her faith. By the end of that first day, 12 ducklings had successfully emerged. During the next 48 hours, more shells cracked open one after another. When the final count was complete, 34 healthy ducklings stood beneath the warm brooder lights, filling the barn with cheerful chirping that seemed to chase away every lonely silence Margaret had carried since Robert's death. Dr. Hannah Cooper arrived early that afternoon carrying several veterinary instruments and immediately began examining every duckling. Watching the energetic birds wobble across fresh straw, she smiled with genuine excitement. These hatch rates shouldn't have been possible from eggs considered unsuitable for commercial incubation, she admitted. She carefully compared Margaret's daily records with Elias Hale's original journals. The similarities were remarkable. Every temperature adjustment, humidity level, and beeswax application followed the forgotten method almost perfectly. Hannah quietly realized she was witnessing not merely a touching farm story, but a scientific breakthrough that deserved serious attention. Hannah requested permission to publish preliminary observations through the university's agricultural extension program. Margaret agreed on one condition. "If my father's name appears," she said gently, "let it be because he tried to save life, not because anyone wants to make money from him." Hannah nodded without hesitation. Within days, photographs of Margaret holding the tiny ducklings appeared on social media. Local residents who had laughed while watching her climb into the dumpster now shared the story with friends across Pennsylvania. A regional television station filmed the ducklings following Margaret across the snowy farmyard, while another interview showed her explaining that every living creature deserved at least one honest chance before being discarded. Her quiet words reached millions of viewers far beyond Lancaster. Soon, trucks carrying journalists, university researchers, and agricultural specialists began arriving at the small farmhouse. Among them was Dr. Michael Reeves, a 54-year-old poultry science researcher from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Tall and broad-shouldered, with neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, thoughtful brown eyes behind thin glasses, and a calm, methodical personality shaped by 30 years of agricultural research, Michael had spent much of his career searching for practical ways to reduce waste in commercial food production. Unlike many scientists who focused only on laboratory data, he respected farmers who kept careful records over generations. After spending 2 days reviewing Elias Hale's journals and Margaret's incubation logs, he reached a simple conclusion. "This deserves statewide research," he said quietly. "Your father's work may help reduce enormous waste without compromising animal welfare or biosecurity." Not everyone arrived with such honorable intentions. One cold February afternoon, a black luxury sedan stopped outside the farmhouse. Stepping out was Victoria Langford, Senior Vice President of Harvest Crest Foods, one of the largest poultry and food corporations in the country. At 48 years old, Victoria projected effortless confidence. She stood nearly 5 feet 10, wearing an elegant navy wool coat over a tailored business suit. Her perfectly styled dark hair framed a composed face, while sharp gray eyes reflected years of negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts. Intelligent, disciplined, and exceptionally persuasive, she believed every valuable discovery could become a profitable business opportunity if managed correctly. Victoria smiled warmly as she placed a thick leather folder on Margaret's kitchen table. "We're prepared to purchase exclusive rights to your father's incubation method." Margaret remained silent. Victoria continued. "The compensation would secure your retirement many times over." She slowly opened the contract. The numbers were astonishing. Several $1 million. University funding. Professional laboratories. Nationwide implementation. Only one condition appeared in bold letters. The method would become proprietary intellectual property owned exclusively by Harvest Crest Foods. Outside the window, 34 ducklings wandered happily beneath the afternoon sunlight. Margaret looked toward them before gently closing the folder. "My father never spent 40 years protecting life, so only one company could own compassion." Victoria's smile faded slightly. "You understand this could become a very valuable technology." Margaret nodded. "It already is. But it belongs to everyone willing to save a life." Within weeks, Dr. Reeves submitted a formal proposal to Pennsylvania's Department of Agriculture recommending statewide research into the Hale method as part of sustainable farming initiatives aimed at reducing unnecessary egg waste. Universities, veterinarians, and agricultural experts joined the study, carefully documenting the technique while improving modern safety standards. Standing quietly inside her barn that evening, Margaret listened to the chorus of 34 healthy ducklings chirping beneath warm lights. For the first time, she understood that her father had never hoped someone would simply discover his journals. He had prayed someone would have the courage to share them. Spring arrived gently across the rolling farmland outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Fresh green grass replaced the winter frost. Maple trees unfolded new leaves beneath clear blue skies, and the cheerful chorus of birds blended with the constant chirping of dozens of healthy ducklings that now wandered freely around Margaret Hale's small farm. What had once been an ordinary retirement property was slowly becoming a place where people traveled not to witness a miracle, but to learn how compassion, patience, and forgotten knowledge could work together. Margaret never became comfortable with the attention. At 63, she still preferred muddy boots to television studios and quiet mornings feeding her birds before sunrise instead of giving speeches. Every visitor who arrived expecting to meet a famous woman found someone wearing an old denim jacket, gardening gloves, and the same warm smile that had comforted frightened patients years before. Whenever reporters praised her success, she gently corrected them. "It was never my discovery," she would say. "It was my father's kindness." As requests for advice poured in from across the country, Margaret realized answering hundreds of letters individually had become impossible. Together with Dr. Hannah Cooper and Dr. Michael Reeves, she created a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving Elias Hale's research while freely teaching responsible incubation techniques to small family farms. They named it the Hale Hatchery Foundation. Unlike commercial consulting companies, the foundation never charged struggling farmers for its educational materials. Hannah prepared veterinary guidelines that emphasized animal welfare and biosecurity. Michael helped create practical training manuals that combined Elias's handwritten observations with modern scientific standards. Margaret insisted every booklet begin with the same sentence written by her father decades earlier. "If there is still a chance for life, never let convenience replace compassion." Within months, workshops filled every available weekend. Families arrived carrying notebooks instead of contracts. Some traveled from neighboring states simply to learn how to reduce waste without sacrificing animal welfare. Margaret watched retired farmers exchange ideas with university students, while children carefully held ducklings that would never have existed without one woman's decision to climb into a dumpster. Among the first scholarship applicants stood Noah Reed. At 19 years old, Noah was tall, lean, and slightly awkward, with messy dark blonde hair that constantly fell across his forehead, clear blue eyes filled with quiet determination, and suntanned skin earned from working outdoors since childhood. His hands already carried rough calluses despite his young age, evidence of countless mornings helping his parents care for poultry on their small family farm. The Reed family had struggled financially for years after repeated feed price increases, and declining market prices nearly forced them to sell everything they owned. Even so, Noah remained gentle with every animal he touched. While other children spent weekends playing sports, he often stayed inside the chicken house nursing weak chicks or injured ducks back to health. Those experiences inspired a dream that seemed impossible for someone with so little money. He wanted to become a veterinarian. During his interview, Noah admitted quietly, "I don't want to help farms make more money." Margaret smiled. "What do you want?" He looked toward the ducklings wandering outside. "I want fewer healthy animals thrown away simply because helping them takes more time." For a long moment, Margaret saw something familiar. The same quiet conviction she remembered in Elias. The same patient kindness Robert had carried throughout his life. The foundation awarded Noah its very first Hale Scholarship. When Margaret handed him the certificate, applause filled the small community hall, but she noticed tears forming in his mother's eyes. That single scholarship represented something larger than tuition. It represented permission to keep believing. Years passed more quickly than Margaret expected. The Hale Hatchery Foundation expanded across Pennsylvania before spreading into neighboring states. Agricultural colleges invited Hannah to teach courses based partly on Elias Hale's journals. Michael helped state agencies develop voluntary programs, encouraging commercial hatcheries to identify viable cracked eggs instead of automatically discarding them. Family farms that once struggled alone now exchanged ideas through the foundation's growing network. Noah excelled in veterinary school. After graduation, he specialized in animal welfare, poultry medicine, and sustainable agricultural practices. Rather than accepting lucrative offers from large corporations, he returned to work with rural farming communities, researching practical methods that reduced food waste while improving animal care. Every scientific paper he published acknowledged one simple source of inspiration: the Hale family journals. One warm evening, Margaret stood outside the barn watching another group of newly hatched ducklings follow their mother across the grass. Hundreds of farms now practiced methods inspired by her father's forgotten notebooks. Tens of thousands of ducklings that might once have been discarded had been given a chance to live. She realized no amount of money could ever equal that gift. The greatest inheritance Elias Hale had left behind had never been his research. It had been teaching others that compassion becomes most powerful when it is freely shared. 10 years passed, and the quiet farm outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, no longer resembled the forgotten property where Margaret Hale had once carried home a basket filled with cracked duck eggs that everyone else believed belonged in a dumpster. Every spring, buses arrived carrying agricultural students, veterinarians, farming families, and conservation specialists from across the United States. They came not to witness an extraordinary machine or a revolutionary invention, but to see how compassion, careful science, and one woman's unwavering faith had transformed an act of kindness into a movement that reached thousands of farms. The Hale Hatchery Foundation had become one of America's most respected educational centers for humane poultry care, sustainable agriculture, and food waste reduction. At 73 years old, Margaret walked more slowly than she once had. Her silver blonde hair had turned almost completely white, usually braided beneath the same knitted wool cap she had worn years earlier. Fine lines surrounded her gentle hazel eyes, but the loneliness that once followed Robert's passing had gradually been replaced by quiet gratitude. Every morning before visitors arrived, she still carried a small bucket of grain through the farmyard, smiling as generations of ducks waddled toward her with cheerful excitement. She no longer cared how many people recognized her name. Hearing healthy birds greet another sunrise remained the greatest reward she could imagine. Although the foundation now employed veterinarians, researchers, and educators from several universities, Margaret refused every suggestion that she retire completely. She continued living inside the same modest farmhouse where her parents had once raised her. The furniture remained simple. Robert's framed photograph still rested above the fireplace. Elias Hale's weathered journals occupied the same wooden bookshelf where Margaret had carefully returned them after every lecture. One object, however, always captured every visitor's attention. Inside her small office, protected beneath a clear glass display case, rested the old wooden basket she had carried home from the commercial duck farm on that freezing winter morning 10 years earlier. Its worn handles remained cracked. Faint stains still marked the aged wood. Margaret never restored it because she believed some things should continue telling their own stories. Almost every afternoon, someone eventually asked the same question. "Mrs. Hale, do you ever regret spending so many years trying to save eggs everyone else believed were hopeless?" Margaret never answered immediately. Instead, she looked through the office window toward children laughing as they gently held newly hatched ducklings during educational tours. Only then did she smile. "I never went searching for broken eggs." The visitors usually looked puzzled. Margaret softly continued, "I believe God simply guided me toward opportunities everyone else had stopped seeing." Silence almost always followed. Some guests expected her to speak about the foundation. Others assumed she meant the scientific discoveries. Many believed she would mention the thousands of ducklings saved over the years. Instead, Margaret gently lifted her father's final journal from the desk. "My father protected knowledge. My husband taught me to repair what others abandoned. And those tiny ducklings reminded me that hope is often hidden inside the smallest chances." She rested one hand upon the old wooden basket. The greatest miracle was never that 34 ducklings survived. It was watching compassion spread from one farm to an entire country. That autumn, the Hale Hatchery Foundation celebrated another scholarship ceremony. Standing proudly among the invited speakers was Dr. Noah Reed, now one of America's leading veterinarians specializing in animal welfare and sustainable livestock management. His once youthful face had matured into quiet confidence, yet his gentle blue eyes remained unchanged. During his address, he spoke less about scientific achievements than about one elderly widow who had refused to accept that convenience should ever outweigh compassion. Looking across the audience filled with young students, Noah smiled. "Every career begins with someone willing to believe in you before the world does." Margaret quietly lowered her eyes. She knew he was not speaking only about himself. As evening settled over Lancaster, the final visitors departed, and peaceful silence returned to the farm. Margaret walked alone toward the old brooder barn where everything had first begun. Warm yellow lights still glowed softly inside, while dozens of newly hatched ducklings slept beneath gentle heat lamps. Outside, the first autumn leaves drifted slowly across the fields. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. She thanked Robert for teaching her that broken things deserve another chance. She thanked Elias for leaving behind wisdom instead of wealth. Most of all, she thanked God for placing a basket of forgotten eggs into the hands of someone willing to carry them home. Standing quietly beneath the evening sky, Margaret finally understood the greatest truth her journey had revealed. Sometimes the most precious gifts God places before us are not the things the world admires. They are the lives everyone else has already decided are beyond saving. And when love chooses patience over convenience, even the smallest act of compassion can become a miracle that changes generations. Sometimes God's greatest miracles are not wrapped in perfection. Sometimes they arrive disguised as broken things the world has already thrown away. Margaret believed she was simply carrying home a basket of cracked duck eggs. But God had placed something far greater into her hands, a forgotten legacy, a lesson in compassion, and countless lives waiting for someone willing to believe they were still worth saving. What others called worthless became a blessing that inspired farms, changed hearts, and reminded an entire community that hope is never measured by appearances. In our own lives, we all meet people and moments that seem beyond repair. A struggling neighbor, a lonely friend, a broken relationship, a dream we almost gave up on. Yet God often works quietly where no one else is looking. The kindness you offer today, the patience you show tomorrow, or the second chance you give someone may become the miracle that changes a life forever. You may never know how far one act of compassion will travel, but God does. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We would love to hear your story. And if you believe that every life deserves a second chance, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our growing family for more inspiring stories of faith, hope, kindness, and God's amazing grace. May God bless you, your family, and everyone you love. May He fill your home with peace, strengthen you during difficult seasons, and help you recognize the miracles He places before you each day, even when they arrive in the most unexpected ways. Amen.